Hey there, I'm Fritz. Welcome back to the state between us. Summer's over, people. We're back in the WACL, back to school. So next week, we got Keith Allen Dennis joining the show to discuss, well, the China lobby, which is an important part of the origin story of the World Anti-Communist League, which is a network of political figures, fascists, capitalists, etc., that formed a multi-decade anti-communist fascist international whose central leadership was based in the old China lobby, again, which Keith will tell us about next week. But its regional leadership roll call was always very interesting, including Stetskov, the Banderite OUN, including the Mexican fascist group of sedevacantists, Los Tecos, including the eugenist fucking Nazi gammon Roger Pearson. I mean, the list goes on and on. I was originally thinking about doing a sort of, a roll call type episode today, just to get everybody in the state of mind to be thinking about WACL. But here's the thing. I also went to my first ever bachelor's party, and it was on a beach, and it was awesome. But, you ingest a thing or two of various chemical properties in various states of matter, and you need a couple days to come down. So I decided to go for an easier topic. Ooh, question mark on the end of that one. Let's say a more focused topic that will pair with Keith's upcoming episode as part of the larger prehistory of the World Anti-Communist League. It also happens to tie in to, of course it does, the National Association of Manufacturers, the Regneries, and the Council for National Policy. Because this whole fucking show is apparently just one long episode. We're going to mix it up, as we go. As you know, we do. But for now, we're back to building up our lore base. So get yourself in that Cold War state of mind and join me. We're going to look at the American Security Council. All right, people, so this is going to be a bit of a shorter episode today, and I don't want to assault you with too many names, but y'all know how it goes. That said, there is one name that I think you should recognize by now, even if this man hasn't had his own dedicated episode about himself, but I would like you to remember Robert E. Wood. But, of course you remember Robert, Bobby Wood. It seems like he turns up every third episode or so, right? His day on the state between us is coming. Don't you worry. There will be a reckoning. But for today, let's just remember that Sears Roebuck chairman Robert Wood's last appearance on our show was as the leader of the America First Committee, where he staunchly refused to denazify the isolationist movement, possibly, as the FBI would later note, because he himself was pretty anti-Semitic and pretty fucking fashy. Well, America First sunk along with the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor, and Wood went on to busy himself with other things, like, as we've discussed, backing the Regnery publishing empire and searching for that sweet taste of fascism with follow-up organizations like For America. I don't know much about them, but this is one of those interim things that Wood got himself into. We'll eventually cover all of his life's story. At the end of the Second World War, let's see, he's got away with backing the planned Legion coup against FDR in the 30s, the business plot. He got away with siding with fascists before 41. So, he might as well do some more fascy shit, right? What are the 50s for? The fascy 50s. So, in 1955, Robert E. Wood meets up with Robert McCormick, owner of the Chicago Tribune, and particularly unapologetic Hitler stan back in the 1930s. McCormick was once called by his peers the greatest mind of the 14th century. I assume that refers to him both being a bit of a reactionary prick, but also probably overestimating his own intelligence. So Bob Wood and Bob McCormick, the Bobs, were allegedly inspired by the National Association of Manufacturers' recent 1951 attempt to build an industrial information network to wage the class war against domestic and foreign working classes within the American sphere of influence, resulting in little more than the banal-sounding Studies in Business Policy number 60 paper, which, to its credit, quickly became standard reading for those interested in labor counterinsurgency. Well, in the spirit of number 60, the Bobs put together a little something of their own called the Mid-American Research Library. Now, this was an outfit that wasn't created by the Bobs. It was created by an ex-FBI agent and his wife, whose names don't really come up that much in the story, but it's the Bobs that made it great, let's say. The Mid-American Research Library seems to me to have been positioned as the heir of the American Legion's obsessive record-keeping of so-called communist activity in the U.S., tracking politicians and citizens alike. But with the Mid-American Research Library, there was this added NAM-flavored interventive education and propaganda program, as well as the sort of NAMmy tactical, unscrupulous approach to polling that Pew brought to the old project. For those of you who might have forgotten that story, definitely check out the CNP episode that I put together for y'all earlier in the podcast. So, pulling together some of the usual suspects from the fascist industrialist roster, like U.S. Steel, Quaker Oats, Kraft Foods, and a swath of media magnates, Bobby Wood and Bobby McCormick renamed the Mid-American Research Library the American Security Council in 1956, selecting ex-FBI special agent and Sears Roebuck executive under Wood, John M. Fisher, to be the council's president. John Fisher had joined Wood's employ as, personnel manager or something like this, with the recommendation and blessing of J. Edgar Hoover himself. And Fisher got right to work recruiting other ex-FBI special agents like him to staff this new American Security Council that he was now president of. These included people like W. Cleon Skousen, who would go on in 1960 to be a prominent figure in the John Birch Society, and Kenneth M. Piper, who had left the Bureau to become an exec at Motorola, also on that sort of personnel side. You know, these people are all the heirs to Harry Bennett and his brutal policing of the Ford plants under old Henry the Nazi back then. So recruiting from the FBI was pretty easy to do, firstly because the American Security Council's original headquarters was on literally the same block as the Bureau's Chicago office, and secondly, the FBI to corporate executive bagman pipeline had been flowing pretty easily since at least the 40s. Their paychecks would be covered entirely by the commitments of the blue chip companies for whom they would now work to uproot undesirables and, quote, anti-free market troublemakers from their 900 member kingdoms, these massive capitalist kingdoms, which included like General Electric, Lockheed, U.S. Steel's Robert Donner was there, who not only funded Mervyn K. Hart, but also fucking Gerald L.K. Smith.
Baby heaven, stop grubbing!
The most American Nazi, or the most Nazi American you could get your mitts on at the time. These are the people creating the ASC. The American Security Council would refer to this as their dossier system and brag that it was modeled on the FBI's. But As critics would soon point out, this was in fact a blacklist and loyalty review service informed by a network of doxers that even included members of the Minutemen militia. And that was before shit got really fascist. In 1958, the Bobs, Wood and McCormick, threw down $35,000, nearly $400,000 in today's value, to purchase a list of 1 million subversives and commies in America, assembled by the recently deceased fascist psychopath Harry Jung, founder of the American Vigilante Intelligence Federation back in the 1930s, where Jung applied his private investigator skills of creeping on people to out commies and labor agitators, selling these doxing lists to interested industrialists and publishing a paranoid newspaper that earned him a reputation for being one of the biggest anti-Semites in Chicago, becoming the primary distributor of a original full translation of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and in the U.S. And also, Jung rolled around with the silver shirts, William Dudley Pelley. I think he was close to the Boonster Joe McNazi, and he was definitely close to these women called the Coglinite Mothers, which was a loose network of moms for liberty types who took their marching orders from the original Irish Catholic Hitler apologist radio personality, Father Charles Coughlin.
1949 finds Americans standing at the barricades of liberty. Behind us stretch 162 years of freedom, and before us yawns a vortex of national doom. Behind us are 5 generations of civic and industrial growth. Before us beckons the specter of commercial decay and industrial slavery. My fellow citizens, it is within our power to make the future of America as glorious as the past. In addition, the American League for Peace and Democracy, an outfit which, like the late Mr. Custer, hides its racket under an assumed name, will convene and engage in its usual activities of promoting communism through attacking fascism, thus misleading the public.
Jung's Nazi ties allegedly extend back to the old country as well. And the accusation is that he had been working with Goebbels' World Service propaganda outlet and was this we know, he was recognized by Goebbels as an ally and friend of National Socialism. He also palled around and worked with the White Russian-backed American Gentile magazine, which featured writings of James True, the original America Firster who manufactured riot weaponry for the Klan. Luckily for the ASC, Jung was also best friends for life with Bob McCormick. That's our Chicago Tribune Bob. In fact, Jung's American Vigilante Intelligence Federation occupied, I believe, a full floor of the Chicago Tribune building that was given to Jung by Bob McCormick to use for his Nazi shit. Their relationship goes way back. So the Bobs, Bob McCormick and Bob Wood, they buy Jung's records of subversives, 1 million names they now have as their baseline. So the American Security Council was really ready to cook now. 1 million names compiled by a Nazi, a bunch of G-men thugging for some of the world's richest and most influential capitalists in the post-war gold rush, blue chip money pouring in from 900 major companies, and led by America's most persistent fascist. The ASC in 1958 had truly arrived. By 1959, they were being invited to the not at all terrifying Military-Industrial Conference to talk about the total victory they intend to win over communism both abroad and, most importantly, at home. The American Security Council gathered enough support in the 1960s to diversify its functions and created a National Strategy Committee of corporate suits and people that researchers have identified as Clausewitzian ex-military brass. Clausewitz being the reference there, primarily but not solely drawn from the Air Force. Among them was Alfred C. Wiedermeyer, personal associate when he was coming up in Germany in 1938. He was trained and educated alongside the likes of Martin Bormann and Hermann Goering, before the war. These people were friends with Wedermeyer. Wedermeyer was one of the loudest apologists for the Nazis before, during, and after the war. And knowing that about him, he was nonetheless one of the main people in charge of planning the European theater for MacArthur during the war. This was, I believe, a plan and analysis assembled called Rainbow Five. So, and then he did that actually after, by the way, serving as commander in the China theater in the early 40s and advising none other than Chiang Kai-shek, right? So here's what he did. Obviously, being kind of a Nazi himself, he leaked the Rainbow Five things through the Chicago Tribune to the Germans. This thing offered like force assessments and a strategy for entering the European theater against the Germans, and also showed that the U.S. was getting ready to do so, right? He was never caught, but investigations done then and also since by historians paint a picture that's pretty clear. One of the things investigators noted about Wedermeyer during this time when he was under suspicion for leaking the Rainbow Five thing to the Germans through the Chicago Tribune was that Wedermeyer was apparently heard to comment that he believed that Hitler was a savior of the world and that America was going to undergo its own conversion to National Socialism. This was America's future, and he couldn't wait to stack up the bodies when that happens. This is fucking Wedermeyer. He's on the board of the ASC from the get. Also, before the war, Wedermeyer reportedly acted as Lucky Charles Lindbergh's interpreter when Lindy was palling around with Goering and politely looking away as Herman's pet lion pissed all over him. You know, that's a true story. But according to the legend here, Alfred Wedermeyer, when he was giving Lindy the grand tour, Wedermeyer did so in a fucking Nazi uniform. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but I really want it to be true. So let's just compromise and call it lore. On the American Security Council Strategy Committee, Alfred Wedermeyer was now rubbing shoulders with old colleagues like General Curtis LeMay, new friends like Congressman Thomas Dodd and Walter Judd, who we might hear more about soon when Keith joins us next week to talk about the China lobby. I'm not sure, but some critical observers believed that the China lobby was getting its second wind here in the American Security Council, WACL, the World Anti-Communist League. By the start of the 1960s, the ASC was boasting not only their million-strong dossier of subversives, but was adding another 20,000 names to it every month and fielding 30,000 corporate requests for security information every year, creating their in-house spy agency made up of 32 police organizations, the private Fidelifax, which was governed by the ASC, though the ASC did not draw money from Fidelifax. The ASC at this point was also regularly meeting with 8 government agencies and 2 congressional committees. The man meeting with the suits in Washington was the ex-FBI agent Lee R. Pennington, who had served as the director of the Legion's Americanism Commission in the past. The ASC also boasted its own stable of intellectuals, including the father of the hydrogen bomb, Edward Peller, and Stanford-based China lobby freakazoid Stephen Possoni, another one of Keith's favorite subjects. And to publish all their stupid shit they were going to have to start putting out, why, the ASC had both Henry Regnery and the elusive William F. Regnery, Billy Fred in my Regnery episode, who sired, as we know, the father of the alt-right. Also, Bob Dole was there.
Bob Dole.
Applying for tax-exempt status in 1960, ASC President John Fisher described the council's mission thusly: to promote the common business interests of American business organizations in defending themselves against those activities of communists and other subversive organizations which are directed against the business operations of American business organizations. I think they mean business. Hmm? Fisher's idea of what a subversive was stayed pretty broad, as you might expect. And they spent the 60s laser focused on protesters and organizers working against the Vietnam War, systemic racism, nuclear proliferation, and labor organizers and SALTs and stuff, which by the 1970s had been severely wounded in the U.S. I mean, and they're limping along, and some of that is due to the efforts of the American Security Council and its predecessors, right? I mean, this whole ASC thing is a pretty good idea if you're a fucking fascist. I mean, it worked pretty well. Like, the FBI was the government's most rabid domestic anti-communist force, but it was still the government's baby. There was a certain level of blanket terror that the FBI couldn't really pull off anymore. Like, they did it, but it was a bit scandalous, you know? Public animosity and attention was growing on the police and the FBI, and, you know, there's stuff they just couldn't do without some sort of extraordinary excuses. So that's not true, though, of these fucking corporations, right? Like, okay, maybe Hoover was losing his ability slowly to straight up threaten the life of some random activist, you know? But American industry could do that with no restrictions. Basically, all you have to do, if you have a massive organization of like most of America's blue chip companies, the largest employers in the country, all you got to do then to starve the anti-capitalist movement is to literally fucking starve it, right? To simply refuse to hire people prone to resistance or on whatever fucking trumped up fantasy charge, straight up fire them. These were things that were elucidated in document number 60 there from NAM. The Bobs, Wood, and McCormick turned American industry into a massive filter, simultaneously guaranteeing a pliant, Cold War-brained workforce in the country's largest employers and undercutting any existent or potential unions that would otherwise have protected them. The fucking Bobs.
Oh, hi, Bob. Bob, good luck with your layoffs, all right? I hope your firings go really well.
Cooperating with the likes of the American Legion and the National Association of Police Chiefs, the ASC began its big data and pedagogical work, conducting seminars on anti-communism, doing polling, that kind of thing. President John Fisher was an avid reader of Lenin, surprisingly, and would even close speeches and essays with the phrase, "What is to be done?" in some, bizarro honor of Lenin. He would teach cops and legionaries that, like the commies, the capitalist also needs its own vanguard, and that vanguard must be organized around a sort of ideological commissariat, which the ASC would come to call freedom academies. Today, the kind of surviving core of the American Security Council is called the American Security Council Foundation, which is based in Washington, D.C., and in this dinky office in Florida. They continue to carry on the Freedom Academy mission, which is sort of what's left of the ASC now. And sometimes, on quiet nights, in the dead of winter, you can still hear them calling out there in the wild.
Can we do it?
TikTok is a classic example of their cyber warfare programs of subverting American culture. I mean,
for all these senators and congressmen to be coming against, they must know something I don't know.
Well, TikTok drives people down rabbit holes, so it's anti-American. It generates class warfare, race warfare.
Does it?
Through the logarithms. So if the articles that they print predominantly favor the Palestinians versus the Israelis. They predominantly favor class warfare in America, the crime, they highlight the crime, and one logarithm leads to another, so that people, and you know that the younger generation is not very patriotic.
Let's get back to the 60s. So by 1964, the ASC had completed its, what I think is its first original book-length text, which was called Guidelines for Cold War Victory, which claimed accurately to have united not only moderates to conservative thought, but also liberal as well, liberal thought and liberals. Guidelines, in my quick kind of skimming of it, proposes a three-pronged approach towards the defeat of communism, which are nuclear proliferation, number one. Number two is psychological warfare on both domestic and foreign fronts. And number three is just economic dominance. It's a big fat fashy fork, it is. It also suggests tightening up domestic security but it will be years until the ASC finally admits that this necessarily entails Americans losing a lot of freedoms they had grown accustomed to. From its inception, the American Security Council has offered its full cooperation with the FBI and Hoover. They openly admitted that they had more legal access to their employees than the state could get without a warrant. They could perform interrogations of anyone working for them at their will, and after joining the great mass of data in their information office, any or all of that info could get passed along to the FBI, or any other fellow travelers for that matter, who were willing to pay for it. Around the same time, the American Security Council began both their weekly publication, The Washington Report, as well as the radio version of this publication, The Washington Report of the Air, sponsored by Schick Razors and led by DeWitt Kopp, who distributed the show to 500 radio stations nationwide.
As Congress ponders the perennial question of how much to spend on national defense, one U.S. Senator, Dewey Bartlett of Oklahoma, urges that the question be rephrased to ask, how much is our freedom worth?
Recently, the CIA states that they may have underestimated the annual military expenditures of the Soviet Union in relation to its GNP by a factor of 100%.
Senator Bartlett says he is convinced that a great majority of Americans are demanding that the U.S. possess a clear military superiority to safeguard the peace.
Even though we have been less vocal, even though the cry, "We're number one," has been reserved for our favorite football team in its most exciting moments, I believe the American spirit still quietly commands us always to say loudly and proudly that we are the first, the strongest, the best, number one, and nothing less.
Senator Dewey F. Bartlett of Oklahoma. This is Philip C. Clark in Washington.
This has been the American Security Council's Washington Report of the Year.
This wasn't their only radio outlet. You see, among the many things that Castro had nationalized on taking power was Sears, was Sears Roebuck. So Bob Wood had a particular dog in that fight, and Radio Free Cuba had shut down. So when that happened, the American Security Council created their own private counterpart to, well, Radio Free Cuba, but also Radio Free Europe, etc., and they called it Radio Free Americas, not to be confused with Radio Free America, which was a totally different thing. So Radio Free Americas, you know, it's a counterpart to State Department a private counterpart to State Department programs, in the same way that the American Security Council was the private counterpart to the National Security Council. Haven't really talked about the National Security Council much, but we're just not gonna right now. That is a different organization. Like they don't have this sort of crazy intelligence gathering system. They just offered recommendations, et cetera, much like the American Security Council would. Anyway, Radio Free America's content was primarily in Spanish and would agitate for Cuban counter-revolution, advocate for a coup against Allende, and other very fashy things that I would guess were probably increasingly informed by discussions going on in the World Anti-Communist League when it was finally formed in the 60s. And speaking of WACL, the ASC was also joined in the 60s by diplomat/spy and Georgetown professor Lev Dobryansky, father of the whole captive European nations thing, and friend to Banderites everywhere. Most importantly, of course, Yaroslav Stetsko, who would be heading the sort of European section of WACL when it was formed. Anyway, more on WACL next week, and probably, far into the future. We're not going to exclusively focus on it, but it will be one of those constant shadows on this show, like the CNP, like NAM, etc. So come 1970, and the American Security Council has grown to thousands of member companies, and by this time, they were joined by the commander of the Citadel, the officer training academy originally built to protect white slave owners from rebellions, and also joined by political heavy hitters like Claire Booth Luce, ambassador to Italy during her best buddy James Jesus Angleton's original ops there, and wife to the ultra-fascist publisher of Time magazine, Fortune, Sports Illustrated, et al., Henry Luce. Claire would advocate for the ASC for her entire life and consequently acts as one of those links between the private American Security Council and its big brother in government, the National Security Council. Also, John Wayne was there.
Okay.
One of the reasons why it's so easy to figure out who was in the American Security Council during various years and exactly what their roles were there was because the ASC broadcasted this stuff, loud and proud, especially when they would create these polls, right? So this is again in that sort of Nam-Pew tradition of using polling as an information collecting source, but also to propagandize, right? They would send out these polls that would say stuff like, hey, you've been selected as a thought leader in your community. We would love you to engage in this poll and help us push through, whatever it was, missile defense or new anti-communist legislation, new anti-labor legislation, whatever the thing was. And they would set up this poll that they would send out to people that they identified as friendlies. They identified them through, their massive information base, and they would ask participants to fill out these unbelievably leading questions like, do you think we should have communist terrorists teaching our children? Yes, no, maybe, that kind of thing. And then at the end of it, they would ask you to send it back to them with $10. It's very obvious what's going on here. I mean, the point of this is to filter out anybody who's poor on the one hand, to target people who own businesses, both large and small, and send then these polls to the U.S. government, to policymakers who would use them as their data source, but also a foil for deeply unpopular legislation by having polls made almost exclusively up of anti-communist capitalists that showed, like, with a pretty big, like a large N number, like a lot of participants that would show that, okay, thousands of people polled, think that we need to have the anti-ballistic missile defense thing done now. Thousands of people polled believe that the only solution to communism is total victory over it. No peace with communism, that kind of thing. So then these polls would make it into policymakers' desks. They would then take them, make them into policy, etc., and continue to sort of fuck up our lives, right? These polls were a constant subject of concern at the FBI desk. Back with Hoover, they would send them out to people, right? Cold mails. And then people would send them back to the FBI because they believed these polls were made by some fucking scam because it was asking for money and it looked like a crazy person made it. Or they thought it was some, deep communist conspiracy to sort of poison pill the anti-communist movement by looking stupid. One person responded like, I'm a polling guy. I work in advertising. You guys are insane. You're basically describing my daughter when you're describing subversives. Like, fuck you. I'm sending this to J. Edgar Hoover. So J. Edgar Hoover's desk got a lot of people concerned and complaining about the ASC. The FBI on their part would just respond saying, there's no investigation into these people. You make your own decisions, yada, yada. That's not exactly true. The FBI was keeping close tabs on the ASC. And on that note, I want to say that a lot of the sources I used here in this episode come from FBI documents that were released by FOIA requests from the Ernie Lazar. Rest in peace. Also, while I'm giving credit, I should mention that I've been kind of going back into the archives and checking out some of the stuff that Dave Emery did back in the day on the American Security Council and WACL and all that. I mean, despite any differences I might have with, Emery and his radio show, I gotta say, there's a lot of kinship with the state between us. Anyway, let's get back to it. So one of the ASC's favorite phrases was peace through strength. Something that they didn't invent, but something that they owned in a way. Peace through strength is something that you're probably really familiar with if you're paying attention to the Trump administration's rhetoric lately. They've been employing this a lot this year already. Many of you are probably also aware that it was Ronald Reagan's key phrase to describe his foreign policy from something like 1978 through his presidency. So that's probably you know this phrase, peace through strength. Some of you might even remember the phrase coming up during the Nixon administration's Cold War policy. And then on top of that, I'd say a select few of you might even know that Barry Goldwater centered peace through strength in his failed presidential bid as a phrase. But let me tell you something that I learned, is that it seems to have originated with Neville Chamberlain in his plea to treat with the Nazis. So when you learn that, the story of peace through strength takes on a new significance. So if you follow it as a sort of biography of the phrase, it starts with Neville wanting peace with the Nazis. It gets picked up by fasci Nazi lovers in the America First crowd, right? For the same reason, again, to avoid a fight with their BFFs, the Nazis. And what happens to America First? Oh, yeah, its leadership becomes the American Security Council. I mean, among other organizations, but the American Security Council is, of course, Robert E. Woods, right? So through the America First connection, the ASC picks up peace through strength. And it was the ASC then who passes it on to Barry Goldwater. And when Barry Goldwater failed them, they got Nixon to wield it in the 70s, which they noted as a big win for them. And by the time the phrase made it to Reagan, the ASC had become an indispensable part of Republican Party strategizing. But I mean, the Democrats were very much implicated in this as well. And the Gipper made peace through strength the center of his propaganda, which signaled the apotheosis of ASC power, but also the peak, right? They didn't get much higher than that in that moment. Trump is just the latest schmuck now to claim peace through strength. But we know why. Like, we know his lineage. We're learning about it on this show, even. We talked about the Council for National Policy's impact on the Trump administration. These are more or less the same people we're talking about here. I mean, peace through strength, if nothing else, has been a phrase that has durably signaled a willingness to work with fascists since at least the 30s. So when you hear it now, spare a thought for the decades of work the American Security Council devoted to eventually stabbing it into all of our brains to this day. Thanks, Bobs.
Bob?
With Reagan's blessing in 1984, the ASC served as the legislative coordinator of the Coalition for Peace Through Strength, which included, at the time, 254 members of the U.S. Congress and 171 other national organizations. Now, 350,000 members strong, the ASC backed the Contras, was all up in Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative way back. I mean, they were into it before Reagan was. I mean, they were into it when it was still called Safeguard ABM back in '69. The ASC shared membership with the Council for National Policy, including Phyllis Schlafly and Nelson Bunker Hunt, and by the Reagan era, it gets hard to know where one ends and the other begins. After Reagan's presidency, the ASC boasted Reagan, Nixon, and Gerald Ford as members of either the ASC itself or one of its growing number of front organizations, like the Coalition for Peace Through Strength, which the council got pretty loose with making. I mean, they made a lot of these fronts from the 70s on. And also in that time, probably it's worth mentioning that their focus seems to have shifted from the course of the 60s through the 70s to the 80s away from labor agitators and communists, never away from communists, but away from labor agitation and domestic socialist groups, and more strongly into counterterrorism and Cold War nuclear geopolitics. In the 1990s, John Fisher and the ASC propagandized for Operation Desert Storm. They urged NATO intervention in Yugoslavia, and they battled against the inclusion of queer people in the military. By the late 90s, the American Security Council had begun leaking money. They weren't as important anymore. And Fisher leveraged most of his retirement savings to try and rescue that property, but he failed. Now, in my estimation, the Council for National Policy had probably taken the spotlight off of Fisher's crew, right? The ASC retreated into its well-established education and propaganda outfits, and today the American Security Council Foundation continues to churn out educational materials for schools and politicians and companies and the military, but no longer has the political power and cachet that it used to. The ASC's decline might have even started earlier, right at the time of its greatest triumph. You see, the National Security Council, right, the real deal, the NSC, fell into disrepair more and more with each Democratic president, beginning with Kennedy, accelerating with Johnson, and finally becoming a mere shade of itself under Carter. The American Security Council, by contrast, was consistently rocking during those periods and was a reliable stand-in for the NSC when the NSC was on the outs, right? Well, Claire Booth Luce, ASC chairperson, convinced Ronald Reagan to revitalize the NSC. That's the National Security Council, right? Just to repeat that, Claire Booth Luce, American Security Council chairperson, convinced Ronald Reagan to revitalize the National Security Council and also to return the intelligence community to its crazier Angletonian days of old, an effort which was only partially successful, from my gathering anyway. Since Reagan, however, the National Security Council remained a staple of all subsequent administrations, thus largely obviating the need for the ASC. Peace through strength was on the lips of both parties. Socialism was effectively dead in the USA. The Cold War was won, and the National Security Council wasn't going anywhere. In many ways, the ASC was kind of a victim of its own success in the end. It did the thing. Some of its big victories in the culture, of which there are many, actually. I mean, they like I said, they did the thing. But they produced this documentary, Salt Syndrome, which was a 30-minute propaganda documentary terrifying people about what will happen with the, what is it called? The strategic arms limitation talks between the US and the Soviet Union. They claimed that this was a Soviet plot, basically, to allow them to more easily take over America's cultural and, political institutions. The Salt Syndrome was shown 2,300 times on local television stations during the 1980 election cycle, and they estimate that it reached an audience of 100 million viewers. So this was, as far as their media goes, probably even more than the Washington Report radio, which did have a lot of listeners, a lot of distribution. The Salt Syndrome was their, I think, big win media-wise, and the last great media thing that they did. So I don't have a whole lot else right now on the American Security Council. We're just sort of touching base with them, getting to know that they still exist in a way. But when they were rolling, they were really rolling. I mean, this was a well-established private intelligence agency and policymaking outfit run by blue chip companies, ex-FBI agents working for blue chip companies, joined by ambassadorial staff, politicians, CIA agents, and I think certainly should be said to have a very important role in the formation of the World Anti-Communist League. Part of that is because of the presence of like Wedermeyer and Possonyi, who were big in the China lobby scene. Part of that was because of Lev Dobryansky, right? I mean, this guy repped the OUNB and Yaroslav Stetsko. And let's also remember that the World Anti-Communist League was like stocked with, fucking Council for National Policy types, Schlafly's, et cetera, et cetera. So the next time we approach the American Security Council, it will probably be in the rear view mirror on our travels through the World Anti-Communist League. That's going to be a kind of a long-term process. I'm going to keep it fresh. We're not going to be stuck on it forever, but we're probably going to hit it and quit it on and off as this show evolves. So, bit of a shorter episode today. Hope you enjoyed it. And at least as far as I'm concerned, I'm just happy to know what Billy Fred Regnery was up to, because that dude was missing a story. And now we know. He was fucking sitting on the early board of the ASC, just being a fascist. So, cool. We got them all. All right, guys. See you next week. We'll be joined by Keith, Alan, Dennis. And for those of you who are Houston's Tavern members or above on our Patreon page, patreon.com/thestateBetweenUs, we will also be having not one, but I believe 2 tavern meetings this month, which will be made available for all patrons a few days after we have them. So check the patreon.com/thestateBetweenUs page for more information. And until then, fuck these guys. right?